Mastering something like Docker demands a lot more than just knowing the commands. Real expertise demands that you know how things fit together under the hood. Well, with that in mind, the plan for this module is pretty much for me to waffle, and it kind of is. So let me lay this down up front. This is probably going to be a pretty long module, and yeah, it's a bunch of theory, and yeah, I am probably going to waffle a bit more than normal. So, if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, maybe you're happy not being an expert and are fine just getting by day to day, that's okay, just skip on over to the next module. But if you do want to know some of the internals, or if you're like me and you need to know this stuff, then stick around. I mean, after all, this is a deep dive course, and I don't want to shortchange you. And I reckon you'll love it. So here's the plan. Yeah, okay, just kidding. Well, probably not actually. But this actually is the plan. We'll be looking at two main things. First up, we're going to take a look at the stuff in the kernel that we use to build containers. And we're going to be doing Linux and Windows, by the way. Then the other thing is the Docker engine, or Docker itself. The stuff that makes driving these kernel things nice and easy. Now to do this, I'm thinking we'll start out with a bit of a big picture. So we'll talk about what a container actually is, which I think you'll find interesting. Then we'll do a high-level view of the kernel internals. Then a short description of the Docker engine itself. After that, we'll start drilling in. We'll do the kernel stuff first, because that's where the container building blocks live. Then we'll do the Docker engine. Okay, now depending on how we get on with the ones above, we might or we might not do this one. You see, the master plan is to cover Windows as well as Linux, but if I get to this point and I'm thinking, maybe we've been a bit heavy on Linux and, I don't know, a bit unfair to Windows, then we'll take a step to the side and we'll dedicate a few minutes entirely to Windows. But let's see how things go. We may or may not do this one. Either way though, we'll finish things up with a recap, which I'm thinking is going to be important, right? Because I feel like we're going to cover a lot. Now then, as part of this module, we're going to cover off a couple of Docker Certified Associate exam objectives, and both from Domain 3, Installation and Configuration. We'll show how the engine can be upgraded without affecting running containers, and we'll explain namespaces and C groups, and this is going to be huge, okay? Okay, now a final word before we crack on. If you're thinking that maybe you might skip this module, just don't. I mean, look, if I had things my way, right, I'd make it mandatory and I'd ban you from Docker until you passed a test on it. I just feel that this kind of stuff is that important. Because I'm not interested, even in the slightest, in you guys walking away from this course, which you've paid good money for, remember? But I don't want you walking away from it with a few commands under your belt and thinking you can take on the world, only to come undone at the first hurdle. That's not what we're after. I want to prepare you like you've never been prepared before. So yeah, this module is about helping you really get it. And yeah, I'm probably going to waffle a bit, but we're getting under the hood, right, and we're revealing the secrets. So grab your usual coffee or whatever and let's crack on. So, the big picture. This module's really about two things: the low-level kernel stuff that we use to build containers, and the Docker engine stuff that makes it all easy. So starting out with the kernel stuff, all a container really is this ring-fenced area of an operating system with some limits on how much system resource it can use. And that's it. That is a container definition right there. Okay, obviously we can have more than one, and I know it's a really simplified definition. In fact, it's my own personal definition, I suppose, because the thing is, there's actually no official definition for a container. And you know what? You can even build all different types of them. But the popular containers that we always talk about today, the ones made popular by Docker and I suppose LXC before that, well, these pretty much fit our definition here. Now, to build them, we'll leverage a bunch of low-level kernel stuff. In particular, we use namespaces and control groups, and these fit into our diagrams just like this. However, right, I know this picture makes it look really simple, but these are low-level kernel constructs, and out of the box, they are a pig to work with. In fact, so much so that they've actually been around for ages, but they've remained obscure and esoteric, all because of how hard they are. And that is where Docker comes into play. It's actually the Docker engine that makes all of this really easy. And that's our two main topics, the kernel building blocks and the Docker engine. Now, sticking with the big picture for another second, okay? The Docker engine's just like any other engine, and I don't just mean IT stuff, so even like a car or a motorbike engine, it is modular. So, although we might interface with it through the CLI or directly to the API up here, a single endpoint, yeah? Under the covers, it's actually a bunch of smaller moving parts. Now, don't worry too much about the names, right? We'll get into that later. But the workflow's pretty much like this. We use the command line to create a new container. The client takes the command and makes the appropriate API request to the container's create endpoint here in the engine. Hey, create me a container, yeah? And the engine here pulls together all of the required kernel stuff, and out pops a container. It is a beautiful thing. But this is all big picture stuff. Time to turn things up a notch and take a look at the kernel stuff that underpins it all.